All right, Joe Combs, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
No problem, man. So, rotational sports, sport performance is your your go-to. What got you into that type of training, that methodology?
You know, as I, so I got my first personal training certification the summer before I started um, my undergrad degree at UC. And I was planning to go through undergrad and then graduate school for physical therapy. And I was kind of thinking, well, how can I prepare for that? I already love working out, fitness, performance. So I was like, I might as well start with the personal training certification. I did that, and then it gave me something to work on during school. So I had just part-time jobs and working in that field. I was going to work one-on-one with patients in the future, and I thought it'd kind of be a nice way to set things up. And everything just kind of built from there. As I learned more, I kind of just followed any interest, kind of went down the Google rabbit hole and thought, okay, if I want to know more about that, what do I do? Sign up for the next certification, next piece of the thing, and one thing leads to another. You meet a few cool people along the way, and just follow it and see where you end up.
Yeah. So, what led you to golf and tennis? It seems like that might be kind of a niche that you have. What's so cool, or what do you like most about those types of sports?
Yeah, very much so. Golf and tennis. So when I so I had a back injury myself toward the end of high school, um, that kind of changed my plans for college sports anyway. I wasn't going to end up professional in anything no matter what I did. So I was pursuing college sports for a little while, and injury ended that, and I needed something competitive to do myself.
Yeah.
And I grew up, maybe golfing a handful of times a year, dad, brother, just family stuff here and there, and thought, well, that'd be a great way just to kind of keep the competitive fire rolling. So I started golfing a bunch myself, and then just kind of as anyone has ever gotten into golf and kind of gets the golf bug, it's just like you want to learn everything you can.
Right.
Um, to pair that, I'm doing that as I'm learning about anatomy, physiology, and started just reading a little bit about the mechanics to it,
Yeah.
and started kind of experimenting with stuff myself. And then just kind of chased after that. And golf and tennis kind of have some overlapping communities, so before too long it's okay, you want to play tennis? I'm like, sure, why not, we'll go there. And then just again just trying to build that thorough understanding of what I'm doing. I'm always kind of a um, I'm just kind of an obsessive learner on topics, so it's just like once I was in, I wanted to know everything I could know.
Yeah. So, like we said, rotational sports seem to be your niche. What is different about a rotational athlete than like a linear athlete? Somebody who is a sprinter or a jumper. So first we'll go there. Like, what do you see the differences in those two? But then also, how do you use sprinting and jumping into your training for rotational athletes?
Yeah, and I think what I find really interesting about rotation is at least at some point it kind of happens in place, right? So you look at linear sports, your goal is generally A to B,
Hmm.
right? Get from one end to the basket, get from one end of the field to the other. So you're trying to propel yourself forward, and that's the goal. But you look at these rotation sports, whether it's a ground stroke in tennis or a golf swing or a pitcher, there's all this momentum going one way, but all of a sudden you're going to take that front side of the body usually and move it violently away from the target,
Hmm.
which then pulls the other part of the body around to end up with that kind of rotation moment. I think the mechanics of that are so interesting to me because it's not just, okay, you push into the ground this way, you go that way, and that's where it ends. Like, no, we're going to try and time some things up so that actually the different sides of the body are moving opposite of one another.
Right. So essentially, we're creating these different torques
Right.
and timing. It all has to be at these specific times to create this perfect sequence to do what you want to do, whether it be hitting a baseball or swinging a golf club, right? Because if those timing sequences are off, well, then bad things can happen. So we know that like sprinting and jumping is part of developing a really good athlete. How do you incorporate those into your rotational sports or different exercise routines, stuff like that?
Yeah, obviously with with tennis, there's rotation, but you have to run. So that's a little bit more of a straightforward pitch to athletes and parents to say, well, this is why you need to be fast. But one of the things I'm always trying to do is make a golfer understand, like, why does sprinting even apply to me, right? Unless it starts raining and I need to get from the tee to the clubhouse, there's not really any sprinting involved.
Right.
But when you look at all of this research out there, you see that like sprinting, it's just power development. People who run faster tend to jump higher. People who tend to jump higher tend to have higher club head speeds. So they all translate from one to another. And at the end of the day, no matter what sport you're competing in, you want to be explosive and powerful. And sprinting is kind of just that very kind of basic raw power expression. And then if you do the right work to get that power expression into the golf swing, they build off one another.
It's like ground force reaction, right? So like, would you say sprinting starts that ground force reaction and you develop that into the specific skills of rotation?
Right. Yeah. So it's the same force applied differently, really.
Okay. So I think that leads us into like the kinematic sequence, right? So like, what is kinematics? We talk about sequencing, we talk about timing, but that all has to happen, as the body moves from one rotating spot to the next. Explain, the kinematic sequence, how you use it. We know that rotation just doesn't start with the hands or shoulders. Like it's got to start with the ground, the pelvis, the torso, and then lead into either the racket or the club. So take us through the kinematic sequence, and everything that's involved with it.
Yes. So the sequence itself is going to be ground up, right? The initial piece of the sequence is this impulse force into the ground. And it is actually opposite of the movement you see. So we hear the term ground reaction force thrown out a lot. I find it interesting that I don't think most of the time people focus on the word reaction. We're not seeing a force. We're seeing a reaction to a force. So when you see a golfer's left hip move backwards or their belt buckle go toward the target, that's actually created with the exact opposite impulse. So if I want my left hip to move backward, I'm actually going to push into the ground forward. The ground isn't going to move, so the hip is going to.
Right.
So if everyone remembers high school science classes and physics, it's every force has an equal and opposite, right?
Right.
I put a strong force into the ground, I get equal and opposite movement of the hips and everything up the chain. So that force kind of propagates up the leg, starts the hips to move, and then the trunk gets added in, and the torso, and then shoulders, arms, wrists, and eventually club, racket, ball, baseball bat, whatever the implement is at the end of that chain.
Okay. So I really like this quote. Rotational power is timing. If the hips are too early or the trunk fire is too late, it doesn't matter how strong the athlete is.
So, there's an analogy I use a lot with athletes where I tell people, I want you to picture that you've got 3 skateboarders and they're holding onto a car to pick up speed, which I don't recommend as an activity, but it's going to pretty good image, right? If you have one person holding onto the back of a car on a skateboard, and then person 2 is holding on to person 1, person 3 is holding on to person 2. Okay, if that car starts to drive at 10 miles an hour, and then person 1 pulls with 10 miles an hour worth of force, everyone is getting propelled forward at 20 miles an hour. Next person pulls, adds another 10 miles an hour. Now you're at 30, last person goes, and we've got 40 total mile an hour. But if as that car is driving along at 10, the last person gets antsy, pulls to propel themselves forward, they hit 20 miles an hour. And once that happens, everything in front of them is kind of useless to them, right? They've already kind of propagated their force. They've hit their 20 miles an hour because they pulled too early. You can't just add in 1 and 2 after the fact.
For sure.
So it really has to happen in that order, and that's really what the sequence is. You get that timing off, your upper body moves too early in the golf swing, the ground stroke, then you can't add the other stuff in later. it is already going. There's no changing that.
Right. I think a key principle here is exactly what you said. If like one segment doesn't load properly, or doesn't load or rotate properly, the next segment is going to overcompensate, right? So that's where it can lead into breakdown or injury. We see it all the time with athletes, is that their timing is off, sequencing is off. They're trying to accelerate a segment that's not getting pushed forward from the segment before it, right? Which leads to breakdown. So we've talked a little bit about sequencing. What does poor sequencing look like? And we kind of talked about it a little bit. And why does timing matter more than like muscle strength, right? So like we can see a lot of these stringy, kind of free flowing athletes that generate so much power. They're not strong. They're strong in a sense of they know how to use the power they have, but they're not muscular strong. So can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so there's, force, adding a pound of force is adding a pound of force. But getting your sequence right is a potential exponential multiplier, right? If I want to create the most force, say, in a rubber band, and all things are equal, I want the thicker rubber band. So I want the higher force capacity. But if I have a thin rubber band and a thick rubber band, and I pull the thin one back really far, I'm still going to shoot that rubber band farther than the thick one because I've stored that energy in the stretch and released it in a more efficient way, right? I always think of the equation, because I'm a little bit of a physics nerd, right? Force equals mass. Force equals
mass times is it acceleration?
F equals mv squared. I can only think of the equation in my head. But the important part is the v is squared, right?
Right.
So it's exponential.
Gotcha.
The ability for that to affect the equation is greater because it's going to be an exponent versus the mass itself is kind of that single unit multiplier. But if I can take my velocity up by double, I'm going to then square that, where if my mass is doubled, it's just doubled.
Yeah.
So that's what you see in the efficiency in these lanky athletes who are creating tremendous amounts of force even though they're slimmer. And then I think one thing that gets sometimes overlooked with those lanky athletes is their levers are also longer, which then again is just a better force applicator.
For sure. Yeah, definitely. So, it's, essentially you're trying to create that whip-like effect, correct?
Right.
All right. Let's get into a concept that I think isn't talked about enough, but I think we can dive into this a little bit, is like childhood development and like foundational patterns. How much of sequencing do you think is founded in childhood motor development, such as rolling, crawling, gait pattern? How does poor early movement show up later in sport?
It's one of those things that's really hard to quantify because you're talking about human beings that end up having very different upbringings for the things they do. But it's really not even something that necessarily becomes an opinion piece when you look into some research, because kids who are hitting their motor milestones, kids who hit their initial early motor milestones are more likely to hit their later ones. If you're delayed early, you're more likely to be delayed late. And that's just going to build on top of one another throughout, right? If a kid grows up throwing a baseball, we can all see the difference when someone who is 30 years old goes to throw a baseball, who's thrown a baseball bunch, and someone who hasn't.
For sure.
That's childhood development. That is an ability for them not just to position things where they need to, right? It's not that the person who didn't play baseball doesn't understand what throwing is, or they can't repeat the positions. It's the fluidity that they miss.
Right.
And that's something that only happens when your nervous system has a chance to adapt to it, and that adaptation starts early. And it needs to happen often if we want it to happen those ways.
Yeah, I think we see, and especially over, let's say maybe the last, maybe 40 to 50 years, we see kids that are being put in containers more often as babies, right? So you've got things like a bumbo seat, or you've got things where they're strapped in, as opposed to a baby who's allowed to just free like roll on the floor or get onto their stomach and get extension out of their spine. So we're seeing a lot of these kids who are strapped in containers, and I think that that definitely plays a role in how they're developing, throughout the course of their childhood. I think a good quote that I found here was the rotational sequence we refined in sports is basically an advanced expression of the movement pattern to learn crawling, rolling, and walking as kids. These foundations aren't solid. If these foundations aren't solid, we see power leaks, injuries, and poor mechanics, that can show up in adults. Um, I think it's important to make sure we're letting, our kids kind of roll around and move and let their body explore and crawl and try to hit those milestones as much as we can. Because we know that, say for instance, crawling, you're using cross body movement, you're using joint loading, using weight shift. All those things are important as you learn how to become a rotational athlete. Um, any more to say on any of that?
Well, and honestly, not just that. I mean, the reality is, uh, you're in a situation that I'm in, or we've had this great fortune of working with some fantastic athletes at the highest levels. And, that's a lot of fun. But at the end of the day, percentage wise, the likelihood you're going to be that is pretty slim.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think if there's parents watching this and listening to this, something I would tell you to focus on is that this has translation to more than physical. I have a friend who is a pediatric specialist physical therapist, and she was telling me about the research of, um, I think, prone positioning, head control, and crawling, and its connection to reading comprehension.
Mm.
And that if you see a child who is missing early motor milestones for being able to control themselves on their stomach, they actually are more likely to have reading difficulty. And it persists for someone who believes that that type of stuff having that effect, it persists for strangely long.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, we try and, again, segment people into, physical performance and mental performance, but, it's really clear out there. Those who perform better physically, who are more active, also do better academically. They tend to have less stress, better mental health. Like, even though we often try and put people in silos, like, it's all connected. Like, your mental health is tied into your physical well-being, is then tied to your academic performance, and it's this continuous loop. You can't really separate them out. So if you're, again, listening to this thinking, well, I don't need to make everything perfect for my child because the likelihood they play a professional sport is low anyway, well, do it for the fact that it might give them a better GPA, better performance academically, and
Mm-hmm.
I mean that's going to be something that's going to obviously have plenty of ability to carry a long list of benefits through life.
Yeah, I mean, this also doesn't mean that if you were, stuck in a container as a kid for, the first several months of life, that you don't have a chance to become a good athlete. I think that, we can train those things, and that's your profession. That's what you do. You help kids, junior athletes, train how to become better sequencers, better rotation athletes. How do you take somebody who has maybe some breakdowns in their sequencing or timing or understanding of coordination? Where do you start with those kids?
Yeah, it's understanding expectations, I think, for the client a lot,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's everyone's familiar with why one of the reasons you try and teach children how to speak a different language earlier in life. It's easier.
Mm-hmm.
But no one sits there and says it's impossible as an adult to learn to speak a second or third or fourth language, right?
Right.
It might be easier with some of these childhood advantages and doing it that way, but it's not impossible as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
It tends to take more repetition. It tends to take more time, but it's certainly not impossible. I mean, there's any number of clients I've worked with who they get to retirement and decide they want to golf because it's a retirement activity, and their movement is clunky and uncoordinated and out of sequence, and you I think one, just make sure they get the repetitions. And then two, just kind of give some targeted exercises, help them understand what they're supposed to do. And it'll happen for them too, but you do often have to set up that expectation of it might be a little bit slower. Um, it's a big crusade I'm always on, which is like reps matter so much. You know, you can understand the swing backwards and forwards, but if you don't get the reps, it doesn't matter. And I think a lot of times people are looking for a secret tip or trick or exercise that makes it all work. In reality, sign up for 10,000 reps and yeah, let's get some stuff along the way, but you've got to hit it over and over and over until you become proficient in that movement.
Yeah, so I think this was a topic we're going to talk about a bit later, but it kind of fits right now is, when you're screening an athlete, a high level athlete, somebody who's playing professional tennis or professional baseball, a high level rotator, and you see dysfunction or something that you think, could correlate to better performance. However, they're already an elite performer, and maybe they've made those maybe they've made those compensations to make them elite. What do you do there? Do you change it? Do you kind of tweak things? What's your mindset on that?
It's very context dependent, right? I've had that situation before, and if someone is coming in for an injury and it seems like there's overlap with what led to their injury, it makes sense to change that. For me, my role a lot of times is to communicate with the coach what I'm seeing and let them help guide what we do and what we don't do and when we do it. In golf, if you're going to make a swing change, it's off season typically. So, I've had a number of phone calls with coaches in the last few weeks about, okay, what adjustments do players need to make to either avoid this recurrent injury, pick up club head speed, or whatever that is. So a lot of it's a process like that. And then for me, the first big thing is to convince them that it makes sense to change it. So I will often go through and video them doing a movement and then a bunch of other professionals, right? There's style points in how athletes move, but certain things are very consistent. And if I can pull up the 8 best tennis players, freeze frame that on a certain part of the ground stroke, and you look different, that's worth talking about why that looks different, what you potentially do about it, what the drawbacks are. Versus you take those same 8 players, you put them at a different point of the movement, they could all look different. That's not something I'm going to chase as much because I've already got data right here saying that people are doing that great but different. I want to go for the things that people are all doing great but the same as one another, because the likelihood that you're an outlier from that is really low.
Yeah, definitely. I know, I like that. I think, like you said, it's important that swing changes or a lot of these things, if there's not an injury, probably take place better in the off season.
Right.
All right, let's get into sequencing based training versus strength based training and your concepts around that. So like strength alone isn't sufficient, right? We've talked a lot about this already. The sequencing is important, rotation, timing, the kinematic sequence, all of that is important. But strength training does matter too. Helps mitigate injuries, stuff like that. So let's elaborate just a little bit more on that. Where do you, how do you incorporate strength-based training into sequence-based training as well?
So a lot of it starts with the assessment of the athlete to find out what they're good at and not good at, right? Like let's take college golf, for example now. College coaches are pretty hesitant to recruit golfers who swing it under 110 with driver. And that just has to do with the length of the courses and how difficult golf gets if you're below that speed. So if I've got a golfer who's, let's say, swinging 105, and I do their whole assessment, and I look at their swing, and I talk to their coach, well, I can then go compare it to my other athletes' data, right? So if their vertical jump is really low compared to some of the other athletes I work with, then I'm thinking, I've got to improve their ability to produce force. So then I might do something a little bit more plyometric based. If I see that their vertical jump is low, but their squat or split squat numbers are low, I'm like, well, you can't be explosive if you don't have the initial force capacity. So then I'm going to shift it a little bit more to strength training. If they're good on strength and they're good on power from these simpler movements, then I'm like, okay, well, that power is not making it to the club face. So I need to look a little bit more at technique and sequencing and figure out why they can jump with the best athletes of the gym but swing 10 miles an hour slower. So it starts with that assessment to figure out where their breakdown is, and then it targets from there.
Okay. What's your assessment look like?
Assessment is, so for golfers, Titleist Performance Institute physical screen, so the TPI screen. Tennis has something called Racket Fit, that's a rough equivalent for tennis players. Baseball, I do kind of a modified version of those, where I take a few out, put a few in. And then pretty much everyone is going to do a power assessment, a vertical jump, a broad jump, a sit-up throw, which is core power, and a chest pass. Then I do some strength testing. Strength testing can be pretty variable athlete to athlete. Most of the time I do what's called an 8-rep predictive max. So you do 2 or 3 reps at a certain weight, and then you just tell me if you feel like you could do 8. Because the max on rows, bench, and split squats would be really time consuming, really fatiguing, and not super efficient. So we're going to get estimated maxes to start, and then we'll get the actual maxes actually as part of training later on. Then I like just kind of a functional movement assessment, just kind of a coordination piece. You know, look at squats, deadlifts, like a single leg heel tap, a little bit of a wrist control dissociation drill. Can you move your wrist without your forearm moving? Can you keep your elbow still but get your wrist moving? And that's the kind of the basis from the performance side, and then it kind of breaks down from there, where if a number is really poor or movement is lacking quality, then it'll a lot of times break down into kind of this almost physical therapy typical subset of exercise.
Can you use your screening method as a predictor of injury at all? Or is it hard? Is it hard to do that? Because I mean, our screenings can tell us a lot about the athlete. You know, your movement screen and all the things you do. But are you able to use that and say, if you can't move well here, you know, you have a high chance of being injured, you know, in this area in the future?
Injury prediction research, I'm sure, as you know, is tough.
For sure.
There are some studies with pieces of data that show things more predictive than others. For example, lacking shoulder internal rotation does seem to have a correlation to shoulder injuries in golf, or in tennis, baseball, a lot of these overhead sports. There's always a thought that if someone can't position themselves proficiently during a functional movement assessment without resistance, that they're more likely to be injured. But that's one of those that's really has been attempted and is really difficult to translate into actual data of injury risk. But a lot of times you don't so much need that, because people kind of lead you to it with the subjective, right? So I can often predict someone's assessment results by what they tell me in the subjective, right? If they tell me they have a bunch of shoulder issues, I've got a pretty good bet that they're going to lack either internal or external rotation, and struggle with some of the overhead positions. A lot of times get a compensatory, like, kind of rib flare movement, and it plays out into the screen probably 90% of the time.
Yeah.
So it's more of corroborating it with other things, because what I am a big believer of is I'm not going to take an uninjured athlete who's performing at a high level and try and change something just because it's quote unquote not textbook.
Right.
Right. If you have flat feet, like, I note that during an assessment, but if you're running a 4.340, I'm going to be really slow to mess with that because 4.3 speed is something you can't necessarily teach.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to like, you know, people who are able to perform at a high level are oftentimes making these high level compensations, and they've done that for a long period of time, which have gotten them to where they want to be. So like, why overhaul that and why change that? Unless there's, these repetitive injuries that are taking place. I think you just kind of let those things play out and let them do what they're letting their body do. So I think one of the big things we see, especially throughout golf season, towards the end of golf season, we see a lot of middle-aged men that show up with lower back pain. Is there something you can see in your screen that can help people understand why their back pain is showing up towards the later end of the season?
A lot of it's volume dependent, right? And that's where, like, you talk about when you change something on someone who doesn't have textbook biomechanics. Like, I always like to say, like, the easy answer tends to be the correct answer, at least most of the time, especially in non-professional athletes. So if someone has back pain and I notice that they maybe lack some hip internal rotation and pelvis control, I want to know that, and I'm going to work on that anyway. But if they then also tell me, well, I played twice on the weekend, and then I had 3 days off, and then I had a golf trip for 4 days, that's more relevant.
Had 15 drinks over the weekend,
Right.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's like, what does volume look like? What does work capacity look like?
Right.
And being able to meet the volume that you're putting on your body throughout the course of the season. And we people say that I played, 150 rounds and my back hurts in the fall every year. I'm like, well, what are you doing throughout the season to help ease the stress on your spine? And they usually say nothing. So, I think that if more people can understand the workload balance and how your body's able to respond to the stress that's being put on it, and how we can mitigate that stress through strength training, mobility training, sequencing training, stuff like that. And that's where you play your role.
Yeah, and I think pain is a very interesting concept in the first place, and I read and learn a whole lot about the science of pain. I think it's interesting how we treat it in those situations, right? We treat it like we somehow have this right to not be in pain. We have this right to play 150 rounds of golf. But you kind of have to earn it.
Mm-hmm.
Pain exists for a reason. And let me tell you that if you're doing anything at an excessive volume, you want those pain signals. Because if you don't get pain signals, then you just do something until something fails.
Mm-hmm.
And once something fails, you have a whole lot bigger problem than a sore back, right? Then you're talking surgeries and braces and casts and things like that. So pain inherently is a good thing because it stops us before we get to those.
Right. It's your alarm system.
Right.
So I love that.
Yeah. So I think that's one thing that I wish people would do a little bit better of, is not, pain isn't just like this boogeyman thing that you're trying to avoid, hoping to get lucky about. Like, there's a bunch of stuff we know that goes along with avoiding it, and you don't get any special right to not have it, just because you don't want to have it.
Yeah. Let's get into, we kind of hit most of this. Let's go. Some of your training framework. What does in-season training look like as opposed to off-season training?
So I have a little bit of a kind of a unique way I like to set up training. So I do, like, my probably junior high school groups are probably like the largest percentage of what I do on the performance side. And I do that programming in anywhere from 8 to 12 week blocks. And that's kind of the basis of it. Now, an 8 to 12 week block in the off season has a lot of jumping, a lot of throwing, a lot of slamming, because again, I want powerful athletes.
Mm-hmm.
And then it has a lot of strength. We sprinkle in a little bit mobility there, which is a whole other topic. I try to put mobility work in strength work, which I could probably talk about endlessly, but like that's kind of that framework. Is a lot of power, a lot of strength, because I don't have to worry about an athlete being sore for a golf tournament when it's the middle of January.
Mm-hmm.
So I can push them pretty hard. They can allow their bodies to recover, and that's okay. That being said, some of them do travel and play. So I keep all my groups a 1-to-5 ratio. So either do groups of 5 or up to 5 or groups up to 10 and bring in a second trainer. And I just tell athletes, like, if you have something coming up, tell me. Ideally before you walk in the door. A text the day before so I can make the adjustments as opposed to right when we're standing in the gym is preferred. And it's, okay, so you're taking off to play a tournament. These 2 exercises have a really high demand, more potential for soreness. Let's modify those. That way you're still ready to go play. And that gets to be really important in season. But in-season workouts are a little bit more mobility, stability, sequencing, control, coordination based, so that a lot of times even the in-season workouts don't take an adjustment, even if you're going to go play the next day, because they're already targeting things that aren't going to really change how you feel the next day so much.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned you like to utilize your mobility training within your strength training, and you can kind of elaborate on that for a little bit. Let's go into it. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, so I start people with the fact that tissues don't inherently shorten. There's no physical change in the fiber of someone who is tight versus not tight, other than maybe if they've been casted or something like that. But there's no physical properties change. And tightness is perceptual by definition. I've treated gymnasts who can put their elbows on the ground bending forward who tell me their hamstring's tight. That's different than someone who says their hamstring's tight and they can't reach to the top of their shoelaces been bending forward. Mm-hmm. So you have to kind of understand that both it's perceptual and it's for the most part nervous system regulated. So I usually tell people, give your reason a muscle to be okay with lengthening. Mm-hmm. Don't try to force it to lengthen. So if I want someone to work on hamstring length, for example, as opposed to like lay on your back, a strap around your foot, pull your leg as far up, I want them to do maybe a standing straight leg raise where if you picture yourself standing straight up and down, and then with your knee straight, you try and raise your foot as high as you can. So now you're lengthening that hamstring, but you're doing it under your own active control. Okay. So your nervous system is going to be more likely to adapt to something you're doing under your active control versus passive. Or you can even do like a toe touch while holding a weight, a generally lower weight, and work on controlling that muscle through its maximum length, through its full range of motion, emphasizing control over it.
Proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation.
Right.
Okay.
You're giving your muscles a reason to be okay with lengthening versus trying to force them lengthening, right?
Yes.
Because if you're tight, the question is why, right? You don't just get tight for the sake of getting tight. If you're getting tight, there's usually a reason. Maybe it's pain, maybe it's a lack of familiarity with the position, maybe it's lack of stability or control. None of those things are treated other than maybe familiarity of the position by a passive stretch. Mm-hmm. You need something active and dynamic to hit those other 2 of the 3 pieces. So it's going to tend to be more effective and hopefully let your nervous system allow that movement. That being said, there's people out there who do great work with that and they don't get the flexibility they want. You have to remember, like everything else, there's a genetic piece.
Most definitely. Would you say muscles that feel tight are often muscles that are weak?
Yeah, I would say that's probably the most often situation. That muscle or a related muscle. Okay. And again, I always take it back to the why, right? If I'm bending forward and I can't touch my toes, to me that's my brain saying, I don't trust you at your toes. So if I get stronger in whatever position I'm stuck at, my body or my brain might give me another inch or 2. Mm-hmm. And I do that over a few months, then I might get down to the toes, and it's okay. Okay, now you can go there because we trust you to be there, right? That's why we're good at moving in ways we move all the time and not ones we don't move.
I mean, there's this massive protective mechanism that our brain puts throughout our body. And, some of that shows up as muscle tension and tightness. Dude, awesome. I loved every second of this conversation. I think there was so much information here that people can learn from. And I think that, you doing the work you're doing is exceptional for the athletes that you're training. So, great job. And I'd love to have you on and continue our discussions in the future.
Awesome. I'd love to come back.
All right, man. Thanks for coming.